Men and women in the church have different responsibilities. Sometimes the responsibilities overlap. Sometimes they stay a little bit separate. Relief Society is the area that women have to fully participate in the life of the church. Not fully participating in Relief Society means not fully participating in the life of the church.
In 1921, with the passing of Relief Society General President Emmeline Wells, it was noted by one of her contemporaries that she was the last of those women leaders who had known the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. Susie Young Gates observed that with her death, Nauvoo quietly faded into history, dear, she said, but very distant. Can the women of Relief Society today know who they are or what they are, unless they know and understand what happened in Nauvoo and beyond? The records from that time, Nauvoo, serve to establish history, create precedent, and nourish faith. Those original Relief Society minutes from Nauvoo were regarded as a sacred record, a constitution, as it were, that provided the authorization and pattern for women's temporal and spiritual ministry. The sermons of the prophet Joseph Smith were quoted frequently throughout the 19th century to inspire as well as to teach and establish the ministry of women in the Restoration. For many years, it has been the earnest desire of many to make those records available. And now, at last, they are. The first 50 years of Relief Society is a selection from volumes of records kept by women chronicling the history of Relief Society in its first 50 years from 1842 to 1892. The records contained herein represent not only an institutional history of Relief Society, but also the personal mission of individual women to seek holiness and purity. Indeed, to come unto Christ. In this History of the Saints special presentation, we will show you some of what this new book contains. We begin with this question answered by the book: what was the purpose of Relief Society in the first place?
One question people have is why when they came to Joseph Smith with the idea for a sewing society, a charitable organization, and there were lots of these in the country at that time, why did he change it? What was different from a sewing society? How was Relief Society that he helped to organize different than a sewing society? And it's about having the power of God in the organization.
Joseph Smith had a grand vision. I sometimes think that much as the School of the Prophets prepared the elders in Kirtland to go forth on their missions, that the Relief Society meetings and Joseph Smith's teachings to those women prepared them to take on their responsibilities in the church. And this included the charitable work for which they were named.
Joseph Smith told the women that this Relief Society had been organized not only to relieve the poor, but to save souls. And I think his intention in attending those 6 meetings of the Relief Society was to focus on how to save souls, their own, as well as their families and their friends, their neighbors, their progenitors, everyone, because everything that he had to say from in each of those meetings pointed to the temple and the saving ordinances of the temple.
He clearly used the Relief Society to prepare women to receive the ordinances of the temple. And he talked about a kingdom of priests. He talked about their moving according to the ancient order and talked to them about receiving the privileges and blessings of the priesthood. So from the beginning, there was both a temporal and a spiritual dimension to Relief Society. And of course, in Mormonism, we don't separate them, so we can't fully separate them out. But both of these strands ended up being of great importance through the history of the Relief Society and remain important today.
Joseph gave to the women an eternal perspective of their lives, which they probably had not gained in the various religions from which they came. They saw that this life was a preparatory life, really, for that which was to come, and he made them feel that it was worth any sacrifice they had to make in order to gain the riches of heaven that he had promised to them through the blessings of the temple. And the Relief Society just was a schooling for the women. This is where they began to understand what awaited them.
In Nauvoo and later in Utah, the charitable work was a remarkable part of this institution. For me, there is really nothing more moving than these Nauvoo minutes with respect to charitable work.
He wanted the women to reach out, to bring into the fold, and not to reject those who didn't quite understand the significance of the gospel that it was being revealed to them in this day. He gave charity a broad meaning that went beyond baking the bread for our neighbor or taking some medication to our sick neighbor or to visiting the poor or helping them out. It was a broader sense of charity, of opening our hearts to others and to welcome the wayward and try to lessen their loads.
And then, of course, we see the same thing in Utah as the Relief Society is reestablished, helping those coming in from their handcart trek, especially the Willie and Martin companies caught in the snows. They're making quilts, they're providing food and bedding and clothing and receiving people into their homes. This was a major part of their work in the 50s. And in the 60s, that temporal assignment is expanded. They're not only caring for the poor in their wards, they're trying to contribute to the cooperative movement through home industry, so they're beginning to set up their own tailoring establishments, for example, and knitting machinery. Into the 70s and 80s, we get an emphasis on medical care, and so they're helping to send women to medical school and eventually setting up a hospital. They're storing grain at Brigham Young's invitation. So their temporal activities certainly expand through the end of the 19th century, and they make such a significant economic contribution, and that leads to their political contribution as well, and in engagement in the suffrage movement and in local politics, and they're taking a role in voting and learning to be citizens.
The purpose of Relief Society then was to care for the poor and to save souls, both here and hereafter. Now, those original minutes from Nauvoo, well, they were just that. They were minutes. They were not a complete record. And because of that, questions arose that took time and revelation to work out. This new volume addresses those questions and the documents that answered them.
I think that this book is also relevant right now because there are a lot of questions regarding the history of Latter-day Saint women, the history of Relief Society, the relationship between women and priesthood. The church in October released an essay on Joseph Smith's teachings on women, temple, and priesthood that laid out the history of many of these subjects. What this book does is it gives greater depth to that historical understanding. Of course, it's relaying the same messages, the same themes, but it does it with much greater historical depth. It does it by presenting the historical documents. It does it with an intent to increase historical understanding and discussion around those really critical questions.
the very presence of so many women begins to raise the question of, are their offices the same as priesthood offices? Are they now holders of the priesthood like the men are? Because almost every woman has an office like the men do. It's in the 1880s that we get some comment and resolution of this question. When Eliza R. Snow is called finally after 12 years of virtually serving as president of the Relief Society, she's not really called and set apart until 1880. But that's a long meeting when this General Relief Society presidency is called again for the first time since Nauvoo. We've had ward presidencies, we've had stake presidencies, but it's not until 1880 that we actually get a general president of the Relief Society again. And when John Taylor comes to that meeting to set those women apart, he makes it very clear that even though the word ordained was used in Nauvoo and has been used through much of the subsequent years in setting apart women for their Relief Society callings, that whether you use ordain or set apart, you are not ordaining them to a priesthood office. They're not being ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood or the Aaronic priesthood. They are set apart or ordained to these specific offices for women. He said, I was there at the first meeting of the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo. I myself ordained Emma's counselors, and they were not ordained to the Melchizedek or Aaronic priesthood. That priesthood was not conferred upon them at that time. Ordaining or setting apart women to Relief Society or young women or primary offices does not mean that they hold the Melchizedek or Aaronic priesthood. He made that very clear.
The Relief Society also gave the women an ecclesiastical identity. They were no longer just the women and children. They were the Relief Society and the priesthood. And I think for 100 years afterwards, the Relief Society saw itself as a companion to the priesthood. Relief Society members didn't hold the priesthood, but they could share it with priesthood holders, and they could share all the blessings of the priesthood because of their connection with their husbands, particularly as they went to the temple.
One of the things that this book does is it provides an in-depth analysis and access to documents that discuss the role of Relief Society and the relationship between men and women, between women and priesthood in 19th century Latter-day Saint history. So for those who have questions on those topics, for those who really want to delve in and understand that history, this would be the place to start.
Another question that many have wondered about, and this volume addresses carefully, about women giving blessings.
A second issue at this time was the healing of the sick, because women were engaged in healing the sick in various wards, often at the end of Relief Society meetings, and they loved it. They saw it as an important part of their charitable calling. So the question arose, by what authority are they healing the sick? And that is something that John Taylor and later Wilford Woodruff and Joseph F. Smith made quite clear, that women could heal the sick in the name of Jesus Christ and by faith, but not by the power of the priesthood. They were not authorized to bless in that way because they had not been ordained to the Aaronic or Melchizedek priesthood.
But then, as Relief Society spread over the globe, questions and confusion spread about this practice, which was happening primarily in Utah.
It's, I believe, 1946 that finally Joseph Fielding Smith writes a letter to the Relief Society presidency that ends up getting copied and circulated, that this is not to go forward, that it's better to call for the elders. I know when I taught a class at BYU and we talked about these marvelous diary accounts of women healing the sick, one of my students was just horrified and said, how dare those women, didn't they know they were stepping out of their place? No, that was their place at this moment in time. But things change, and that is one of the clarifications that has been made. Not that women don't participate in healings by faith in their own ways today, but I think generally laying on hands to heal the sick would not be appropriate today in the same way that it was then.
Plural marriage in the 19th century? That's another of those questions we hear so often today, and this volume addresses it. And another, why did Brigham Young temporarily halt the operations of the Relief Society in 1845? Those kinds of questions and more are addressed in this new history. It is Women's Voices from the Past Speaking Anew.
In the October 2015 General Conference, President Russell M. Nelson gave a great talk in which he called for women to speak up and to speak out. And I think this applies equally as well to the past as to the present. We need to do a better job in our culture at listening to women's voices. And this book gives us an opportunity to do so by presenting their voices without a filter from the past. The intent of the book is to give us access to women's voices, both to general church leaders like Eliza R. Snow, as well as many, many other women who spoke in a Ward Relief Society meeting, or who kept a journal about her experience in Relief Society, or who was trained as a midwife or even as a physician in territorial Utah. So we hope that we're able to give people access to their voices, to enable these historical women to continue to speak up and to speak out.
We hear about these fantastic 19th century Mormon women. They were articulate, they were on fire. When you read some of their letters, newspaper articles they wrote, speeches they gave, these women had such a vision and so much energy that they put into achieving that vision. I think if we could have that vision of Relief Society, what it can bring to our lives, what it can bring to our families, what it can bring to our neighborhoods, our communities, and out to the world, we'll have a stronger sense that we are doing God's work that we were put on earth to do. A stronger sense of wholeness, satisfaction, well-being, happiness, a stronger sense of inspiration in our lives. So it's a thing worth doing.
This book gives us information on a lot of women. Over 2,000 names of women appear in these pages. And one of the things that we've done is to identify every one of these women. And all that biographical information will go on our website because we wanted to be able to give enough life to these women. So 400 of the women and men who appear in the book, we've done fairly extensive biographical research on. The other 1,600, we've made sure that we know who they are, at least birth and death dates.
From this point forward, anyone who writes or teaches or studies early Latter-day Saint history can't ignore this volume.
The history of Relief Society isn't just a history for Latter-day Saint women. It's a history for all of us. And we hope that this volume isn't just timely and relevant for Latter-day Saint women, but for all who are interested in and care about our heritage. Latter-day Saint women's history is Latter-day Saint history, and we need to do a better job at paying attention to the women in our past, to hearing their voices. One of the exciting things about this volume is that it gives us unmediated access to the voices of women.
I think this volume is of immense importance to Latter-day Saint women today. Of course, it's of interest to scholars of Mormonism. That goes without saying because it unfolds the documents that show women's place in Mormon history. So it will have very broad appeal. But to Latter-day Saint women specifically, to have in their hands the words of Joseph Smith to women specifically. This is a great treasure. They haven't been canonized, but they might have been. These are beautiful, instructive, doctrinal addresses that are of critical importance in understanding the role of women in the gospel plan as well as within the church.
We can't understand Latter-day Saint history without understanding the history of the Relief Society. The contributions of the Relief Society were so important in the 50 years covered by this book. If we want to understand the economics of territorial Utah, we have to understand the Relief Society. If we want to understand politics in Utah, we have to understand the Relief Society, which helps spearhead the right to get women to vote. If you want to understand Latter-day Saint history, if you want to understand Utah history, if you want to understand Western history, if you want to understand American religious history during this era, you have to take into account the key role played by the Relief Society.
think the other dimension of this volume that is so important is that we have such a tendency to live in the present, to think that we're the only people with questions. This Relief Society president is the only one who's had a conflict with her bishop, or difficulty with a sister in her ward, or some issue that needs to be resolved, or some objection to the way issues are resolved. And I think by seeing real life people working through these questions over time and maintaining their faith and finding ways to reconcile with one another and go forward in doing their charitable work, maintaining their commitment to and faith in the temple and its ordinances, these are inspiring, strengthening stories.
In one of those first Relief Society meetings, President Emma Smith made the following statement: "We expect extraordinary occasions and pressing calls." I wonder if Emma or any of the women that were there realized just how much that would actually come to pass. This new volume, The First 50 Years of Relief Society, reveals just how extraordinary those women were and the incalculable contribution that they made. I'm Glenn Rawson. Thank you for joining us.